Welcome to On English Speak Through Stories. An unpleasant man, Cyril Hare, in the police car, which had been called from the main police station at Hampton, drove quickly around the edge of the American airfield and on up the village street. It was 8:30 on a fine spring morning, and the road was empty except for a line of American Army cars that now seemed to be a common sight on the country roads of that particular part of England. A sergeant of the military police, who was sitting beside the young driver, looked at them with little pleasure. It was not that he had any real objection to Americans. On the whole, they did not behave worse than the local people, but when they did behave badly, the way in which they did so was different. This was, in itself, an offense to people who had been brought up to believe in the regular order of things. Consider this business at Hawthorne House, for example. There was sure to be an American mixed up in it, and that would cause trouble. Hawthorne House was an old, rather dark little house, which stood by itself on the far side of the village. There were many like it in the area. The owners rented them out to visiting army officers and profited greatly by asking for high rents. As the police car reached the entrance, the police doctor's car came up behind it, and the three men went into the house together. The sergeant was rather relieved when the door was opened by someone who was clearly an Englishman. A middle-aged man with rather unhealthy skin, wearing the dull clothes of a manservant. "Will you come this way, please?" he said in the accepted language of his profession and led them upstairs to the best bedroom. He opened the door and stood to one side for them to enter. The man in the bed had certainly been dead for some hours because the body was already cold. The sergeant judged that he was about 45. There was little character in the round face. He was dressed for bed in inexpensive and rather bright clothes, which did not seem to go with the simple furniture. On the table by the bed, there was a half-empty bottle, an empty glass, and a small round medicine box, which was also empty. On the floor, beside the table, was a letter in an envelope that was simply addressed to Mr. William Harris. It had not come by post. He gave some instructions to the young police driver and left the room. He found the servant standing in the passage just outside the door. "Let's go downstairs, shall we?" he suggested. "We could talk better there." The man went before him down the narrow staircase into the sitting room and watched him closely as he stood respectful but anxious in front of the empty fireplace. "You haven't been here long, have you?" he began. "No, sir, only 3 days. We were in London before that," but how easily it was said with a smile. "You forgot to lower your head for the wooden beam at the top of the stairs. This place was filled with furniture, I suppose, to an American." "No, sir, not to an American. Mr. Harris was English, but I understood that he had lived in the United States for some years, and I may say he picked up some American habits." He was talking more easily now. Smiling usually made people feel comfortable. "And what's your name?" "Wilson, sir. Thomas Wilson." "Well, Wilson, tell me when you found out that your master was dead." "When I went in this morning to give him his cup of tea, sir, I didn't touch anything but rang up the police immediately." "I hope that I did right." "Quite right. And when had you last seen him before that?" "Last night, sir, at about 10:30. He'd given me a free evening. And when I came in, he was just getting into bed." "And what can you tell me about Mr. Harris?" "I can tell you very little, sir. I had only been with him for 2 weeks. He hired me through Chilton's, the employment agency. No doubt you've heard of it, sir. But I can tell you that his ways were, well, a little strange, sir." "Strange?" "Well, naturally, you've just told me that he had American habits." "No, sir, I don't mean that they were strange in that way. He was afraid." "What of?" "Oh, of people, sir. And of Americans especially. That was why he took this house. He said that there were too many Americans in London and that he wanted to get right away from them. Sergeant Place laughed at the idea of a person coming to Mackshaw in order to get away from that particular danger. He chose the wrong area to come to, then, he said. Didn't he know that the Americans had an army base in the village? It seems that he didn't, sir. I think that it was a great shock to him when he found out. Only yesterday, he said to me, Place thought to himself that by helping these anxious witnesses to get over their fear, you encouraged them to wander on forever. He decided that he had better return to the more important matter of Mr. Harris's death. He interrupted Wilson. Do you know anything about this? He said and produced the envelope which he had taken from the bedroom. That's oh yes, I gave it to Mr. Harris last night when I came in. Where did it come from? The staff officer gave it to me to give him. I don't understand what staff officer. I was going to tell you, sir, when you interrupted me, the man said patiently. It happened yesterday morning. Mr. Harris and I drove down to the village to do some shopping, and we had to stop in the village street where they were repairing the road. They were only letting through one line of cars at a time. There was an American Army car coming the other way. This staff officer was in the front, and as he passed, he seemed to recognize Mr. Harris. How did you know that? He spoke to him, sir, just one word. It sounded like blimey. Not a very American word, Wilson. Are you sure it wasn't limey? It could have been that, sir. What does that mean? If I may ask. It's a rather insulting name for an Englishman. Whatever it was, it seemed to trouble Mr. Harris a good deal, sir. He drove on as soon as the car had passed and never stopped in the village at all. We did our shopping in Hampton. Then, last night, I saw the staff officer, again at the local with the spotted dog. I spent my evening there. The place was full of American soldiers, and he was with them. He recognized me immediately and spoke to me. He bought me 1 or 2 drinks, and then he began to ask me questions, sir. He found out who you were and where you were living and so on, sir. Then, just before the enclosed, he asked the innkeeper for a bit of paper and an envelope. Wrote something, and told me to give it to Mr. Harris. So I did so, and you don't know what was written in the letter. Naturally not, sir. In spite of his polite voice, the man was offended. Sergeant Place recognized this and smiled slightly. You might be interested to know, here it is. Place read, well, Limey, this is quite a surprise. I'll pay a visit to your little hiding place about midday tomorrow, so you had better be there. Is that all, sir? That's all, and it's signed Joe. That's the name of the staff officer, no doubt, sir. If you saw him again, would you recognize him? All these Americans look very much alike to me, sir, but I expect I would. Well, said Place as he put the letter away. That appears to be all. You gave him that letter and he's dead. He died of what, exactly? What did he die of, doctor? He asked as the police doctor came into the room. A form of poison, without doubt. I can't say more until we've made a thorough examination. He died about 8 to 10 hours ago, I should think. I can see no sign of violence. I'm going now, unless you still want me. Shall I make arrangements to have the body moved? Not just yet, thank you, doctor. I would prefer not to have anyone in the house until the afternoon. We may have a visitor about midday. When the doctor had gone, Place called to the young driver who was upstairs. Percy. Yes, Sergeant Place. Take the car around to the back of the house. Will you? I don't want it to be seen from the road. Percy came downstairs. I've searched his room fairly thoroughly, he remarked. He's got some very bright American clothes. I found this in a drawer. I thought that it might interest you. He handed to Place a small pile of newspaper cuttings and went out to the car. Place saw that they were all taken from American papers. And were arranged so that the most recent was on top. It was the top one, in fact, that caught his eye this morning. John Benjamin Spencer was put to death for the murder of bank guard Edward Hart, it began. He looked through the rest of the cuttings and found a familiar name, William S. Harris, who was born in England and was a former business partner of the defendant. Was today called as a witness in the case against John B. Spencer. "Do you need me any more, sir?" said Wilson, who was still in the room. "No," said Place, whose attention was fixed on the newspaper cuttings. "Yes," he added immediately. "What did Mr. Harris do when you gave him the note?" "He read it, sir." "Anything else?" "Then he sent me downstairs to get a bottle of alcohol and 2 glasses. 2 glasses. Mr. Harris was very informal, the man explained. He had American habits, although he was an Englishman like you or me. He asked me to have a drink with him. He was not at all like any other gentleman that I have served." Place looked at his unhealthy face and his unsteady fingers, which were yellow with tobacco. "You drink quite a lot, don't you, Wilson?" he said. "A little, sir, I must admit, now and again." "Is that why you lost your last post?" "No, sir," he was deeply offended. "I've been in first-class service all my life, and my employers have always been pleased with me. My last position was with Lord Gaveston. I was in his service for 5 years, and I only lost that post when he and his wife separated and the family broke up. This position was not really good enough for me. I accepted it because Chilton's agency had nothing else to offer at the time, and the wages were good. Chiltons know me, sir, and they would put me forward for the best employment. Ask them now if you don't believe me. The telephone number is Belgrave 8290. You can make a long-distance telephone call immediately if you like." "I think you've said enough, Wilson." "There's no need to get excited," said Place to calm him down. "I'm sorry, sir, but a man in my position depends on having a good name. I've had a shock, and I've had no breakfast this morning yet. Just finish your story." "You said that you brought Mr. Harris the bottle of alcohol." "That's right, sir. When I brought it, he was sitting on the side of his bed. He poured some of it out into 2 glasses, and we both had one. Then he told me to leave the bottle and his glass with him, and we said good night. I didn't see him again until I found him this morning. Thank you, Wilson. You've been most helpful. Now go to the kitchen and get yourself something to eat." Place looked at his watch. It was just 9 o'clock. He had a 3-hour wait if Staff Officer Joe came on time, if he chose to come at all. If he did not, it would not be easy to find him. He considered how many staff officers at the big American base were called Joe. The situation could have been worse, of course. The name on the letter might have been Butch or Red. Half the men in the American forces seemed to share those strange names. But Joe was nearly as common. For now, he must wait. A policeman often has to wait. But this time Place found it quite pleasant. He had a comfortable chair to wait in and a pile of newspaper cuttings to read. The cuttings reported a very ordinary kind of murder. A guard had been killed during a bank robbery, and like many murderers, John B. Spencer looked like a very ordinary young man in his photographs. As for Mr. Harris, it seemed that he had been lucky only to have been a witness and not to have been charged with Spencer. Or had he been so lucky? Sergeant Place was not so sure. When he thought of the man who had been frightened and was now lying upstairs, he read the cuttings again and again until he heard Percy call from the hall, "Here he comes, Sergeant Place." Place opened the door for a young man in army uniform who looked at him in surprise. "Have I come to the right place?" he asked. "They told me that this was Mr. Harris's house." "They told you quite correctly. Come in." The visitor entered. He looked hard at Place and then at Percy. "You're a policeman, aren't you?" he said. "What's happened? Did you write a letter to Mr. Harris last night?" "I did. He was found dead in bed this morning," the young man took a little time to think this information over. His face showed no expression. As Place watched him, he thought that the line of his jaw seemed familiar. "Well," he said at last, "that saves a lot of trouble, doesn't it?" "Does it?" Place asked. "That rather depends on why you wanted to see Mr. Harris. Perhaps we needn't discuss that at present. I'm grateful that you gentlemen gave me the news, that's all. I'd better go now. Wait a minute. Before you go, there are 2 questions that I'd like to ask you. What sort of man was the late Mr. Harris?" "He was an extremely unpleasant man," said the staff officer. "What's the other question? Is your name Spencer by any chance?" "Yes. I'm Joseph Wilbur Spencer." "And John Benjamin Spencer?" "He was my brother." "Thank you, Spencer. You have told me all I want to know. Now, would you care to see the body and make sure that it is Mr. Harris, sir?" said Spencer. "During my stay in this country, I have developed a great respect for your police, a very great respect. If you tell me that Harris is dead, I don't ask for any proof. No, sir, the word of the British police is good enough for me. But I will say this, you've given me a piece of news that is going to make the people in my hometown very thankful when it is known, as certainly it will be. And now, I will say good day to you. Percy, ask Wilson to come in here for a minute," said Place after the visitor had gone. Percy went out to the kitchen and returned with a smile on his face. "I think that Wilson decided against breakfast and had a few drinks instead," he said. "I can't wake him up. Well, he's had a shock, as he said himself. I don't really need him. We'll ask Scotland Yard to send a man round to Chilton's. Perhaps they can tell us something about the late Mr. Harris. We shall have to find out more than the fact that he was unpleasant." He picked up the telephone. "I want to make a trunk call, please, miss." "Get me." He put the instrument down with a crash. "Percy," he shouted. "Get the car out quick and go after that staff officer. Bring him back immediately, by force if necessary." To a confused and rather annoyed Spencer, Sergeant Place said, "I'm sorry, but I must know for certain if the body upstairs is really Harris." "If you say so, sir, I have no real objection to dead bodies. But I would have thought," he stopped suddenly as Place threw open the door to the kitchen. "Limey!" he cried. He bent over the half-conscious figure, which was breathing heavily. "They said that you were dead." "Not yet," said Place cheerfully, "but he soon will be. There is less delay over British criminal cases than over yours, I expect. Now, if you don't mind, we'll go upstairs and examine the body of Thomas Wilson, the poor, harmless servant whom Harris poisoned last night. When he got your note, he hoped that when you spread the news of his death, he wouldn't be troubled by John Spencer's friends and relatives again. It was a neat plan, and it might have succeeded if he hadn't forgotten that he was playing the part of an English servant. And talked about long-distance telephone calls instead of trunk calls. As he told me himself, he'd picked up a lot of American habits while he was away. I expect that he came down here especially in order to be seen by you and then to pretend to kill himself. Mr. Harris was quite a clever criminal. Didn't I say that he was an unpleasant man?" said Staff Officer Spencer. "You